What's happening there, people? I am shooting on the X-T4 today in F-Log because I'm an expert and I know what all that means. F-Log means flatter than hell. Pretty sure. If I looked it up in the manual, that's what it would mean. No real reason to mix it up today. Haven't used the X-T4 in a while. Bought it probably a year and a half ago. Used it like 3 times. Figured might as well use it. So we're talking about notes on photography today. And I guess if you boil down everything that I do on YouTube or don't do on YouTube, I think really the photography aspect of what I'm doing is obviously the most important part. Although sometimes I get lost. So I do like this series of just breaking down individual images. For those of you who went to photo school, you'll know how common this is. You'll remember how much we did this. And basically, if you've ever worked as a photographer, especially at a place like a newspaper, where basically you're doing this exact same thing every day. Sometimes you're doing it by yourself, and other times you're doing it with a photo editor who's probably this far away from you, telling you how bad you suck at photography, and then just giving you enough encouragement to go back out and do it again the next day, or maybe even later that day. You just never know. So let's talk about story. The picture that we're going to look at here in a minute, I actually already filmed that segment, so I have to be careful about what I say in this segment so I don't contradict myself in what I've already filmed. You know what I mean? We got to talk story. The picture that we're going to look at is one tiny piece of a long story that came about when I was living in Los Angeles in the early 2000s, and I was working as a photographer. I was doing editorial and commercial and a little bit of advertising. And on the side, I was doing all my documentary projects, which is really the only thing I was doing that I liked. So doing editorial assignments and commercial assignments and a little bit of advertising, I didn't really like any of that. That was the kind of work that we all thought, oh, this is really great. This is going to be fun. This is going to pay the bills. This is what we want to do. And the more I did it, the less I liked it. All I wanted to do was photo stories. Problem was getting anyone to pay for it. Almost impossible. By that time, the market in America for long-term documentary work was in the tank, was in the toilet, in the commode, in the can. Wasn't good. Other parts of the world still had an industry and a market for reportage, but in the US, for the most part, no. Is this focusing? Hope this is focusing. Frickin' better be focusing. So digital was just emerging. 97 was really the year that for me digital landed with the first real cameras. I'm not saying these were good cameras by today's standards, but they were cameras that were capable of doing a 6-column newspaper photograph. That was a big deal at the time. But digital was the fracking of photography. It was this fringe thing that hadn't hit the mainstream yet. And it also attracted fringe characters because the cameras were $30,000. And inside the industry, of photo industry, you might have had a few people at that time who were basically commercial or advertising photographers, maybe catalog photographers that were working in-house for a big brand. They were the only people who could really afford to buy those cameras. But on the fringe of this, you had people with government and military contracts who were selling dozens and dozens and dozens of these cameras at a time for incredibly high dollar deals, right? Totally unknown inside the photo industry. But in the camera industry, working for a company like Kodak, which was what I was doing at the time, I quit photography in 97, took a job for Kodak for a couple of years. That's when these cameras first landed. That's when I started to meet some of these fringe characters who were selling huge amounts of these cameras to government and military contracts. That was interesting. During one of these Kodak meetings, I met someone, an interesting dude, and because I was the Kodak guy, he and I had business together, and he was one of the people that had these government military contracts, and I was like, wow, this is a whole world I don't know anything about. So I didn't know anything about his personal life, but I'll get to him in a second. So I'm in LA, I've got projects going, but I'm looking for a new project, and I hear about something called California Off-Highway Vehicle Recreation Parks. And I'm like, God, that is the worst name of a park I've ever heard. Like, who named that? Fire them, hire a branding consultant. So anyway, I'm like, Off-Highway Vehicle Recreation Parks, what the heck is that? And basically what these were parks that were developed for people that had four-wheel drives, motorcycles, ATVs, quads. They don't want those people just tearing across public land because those machines tend to have a detrimental effect on, in some ways anyway, on the land itself. So you don't want people that have these machines to just tear across public land, national parks. So they created these parks specifically for that. I also heard about something called the Sand Association. And the Sand Association was an association of people who had a vested interest in keeping these parks open. And they had knowledge of the parks, and they were sort of the gearhead, and I don't mean that in a bad way. They were the people who were using the bikes, the machines in these parks. And on the flip side of this, you had the Sierra Club. And as you can probably guess, the Sand Association and the Sierra Club were not exactly simpatico about how these parks were being used. So I found this fascinating. And I was like, that's my story. There's a battle going on between Sand Association, Sierra Club, amongst others, and people who want to close these parks for environmental reasons, and people who want to keep them open because they enjoy using the parks. And I was like, wow, this is going to be cool and visual, and I'm gonna have a blast. So I did this. I started this project. And I start researching all these off-highway vehicle recreation parks, and I start researching all of the sort of issues that are happening. For example, the picture that we're going to look at in a minute is shot in a place called Glamis Dunes. And Glamis is a set of sand dunes. They're huge. It's like being in the Sahara. I have been in the Sahara. Let me back up there. It wasn't Sierra Club, Saharan Desert. I've been in the Sahara. And now that I've been to the Glamis Dunes, there's a lot of parallels. Like, these dunes in Glamis are legit, serious, big, fascinating, gorgeous dunes. Dunes move with the wind. So for example, one of the issues that was happening was that the Sierra Club would stake out sections of Glamis Dunes and said these sections are off limits because of either the animals that are in the section or the plants that are in the section. The problem is, if you put stakes in the sand and the wind changes, it'll blow sand over those stakes. So riders were coming up not seeing those stakes because the dunes had changed, then driving into these areas, and the Sierra Club was coming out and saying, see, you guys are purposely violating the places where you're supposed to go or not go. And the riders are like, no, we didn't know. Everything shifted. The other thing that I found fascinating was I started to show up on and photograph on cleanup days, where they would basically say, okay, we're going to take whatever, January 23rd, everybody from the organizations are going to come out and we're going to pick up trash and we're going to do whatever we can to help preserve these parks. And I noticed that the Sand Association on these days and other organizations like them would have hundreds of people that would show up to do the cleaning, and the Sierra Club would have no one. No one would show up from the Sierra Club. So I was kind of like, man, there's a lot of weird stuff happening here. Weird is good, weird is greater than not weird. And so I started to build photos. And at the time I was riding a Honda 600 V-twin Transalp motorcycle, which was great. And I would throw my 4x5 Crown Graphic on the back with my clearing bucket, and I would shoot Type 55 Polaroid. And I would go out to all these parks and I would photograph and I would ride, and it was a blast. So I'm involved in one of these camera deals, these big sale of camera deals. And I mentioned this story to one of these guys that I've met who's selling cameras to these big contracts. And he goes, oh, you got to go to Glamis. And at the time, I didn't know what Glamis was. And I go, what's Glamis? And he's like, looks at me like, you moron, you damn fool. He said, Glamis is a park that's dunes in SoCal, and you won't believe it if you go out there. He said, the problem is it's legitimate sand dunes. And he goes, what kind of car are you in? And I was like, well, I got a motorcycle and I've got a Honda Civic Hybrid. And he just looked at me in utter disgust. You know, he's like, hey, if you can put paddle tires on that Civic, maybe. So no, he goes, look, you can't access the dunes. You have to have a dune buggy to get out into these dunes. And I'm like, I said, I'll just walk. He's like, no, you don't get it. First of all, it's too dangerous. There's too many people ripping around. They can't see you. The distances are too far. And you're talking about walking in deep sand for miles and miles carrying camera equipment. He goes, it doesn't work. And then long, pregnant pause. And he goes, we go out there all the time. I got dune buggies. You should just come with us. And I was like, this sounds good. So I go out on Thanksgiving weekend, and I kid you not, there are 250,000 people in the park. No joke. 250,000 people with motorcycles, dune buggies, jet-fueled, rocket-fueled. It looked like Mad Max, and I was absolutely in heaven. So my buddy backs this dune buggy out of his trailer, and my head said, dune buggy, no big deal. I've been in dune buggies before. This can't be that bad. But he backs this thing out, and it looks like the end of the world. It has like a jet engine on the back of it, full roll cage, harnesses. He hands me a helmet. Now I've got an M6 and a 35 around my neck, or 30, I think it was an M6. I might've had a 21 at that time, whatever. I had 2 Leicas and 2 lenses. So I get in, I got the helmet on, I got the thing on, and now I realize I'm in trouble. I don't like speed. I'm not a daredevil. And I'm looking over at him and he looks like the devil himself. And he's like, oh yeah, I'm gonna take you back in the dunes. So I have a Leica around my neck and he looks at me kind of funny and he lifts up the visor on his helmet and he goes, you're not gonna leave that camera out, are you? And I said, well, my purpose with the camera is to actually use it. So yeah, I'm gonna hold it and shoot while we're driving. And he kind of goes, okay. And then he starts this thing up, and approximately 60 seconds later, as we hit maybe 80 miles an hour across the dunes, my Leica is ruined around my neck. It's filled with sand. The body itself is not filled with sand, but the lens barrel now goes when I'm trying to focus it because there's so much sand packed into it. And he warned me, he tried to help me, but I was like, oh, this is not gonna be that bad. It was that bad. It was terrifying. We were doing 80 miles an hour and you're going up dunes where you can't see over the top. And then you fly off the top of the dune and the dune buggy would fly like this in the air and land on 2 wheels and doing donuts and going up and down. All I wanted to do was get off of the dune buggy. But he did drop me off in the middle of these places. And I still had my spare Leica, which is what I probably made this image that I'm gonna talk to you about today about. And so I think I did put a plastic bag on the second camera, by the way, because I'm super fast learner and you know, that's what I do for a living. The photography is the reward. So this project never ran anywhere. The full project. I probably shot in 8 or 10 parks. I worked on it for over 2 years in all my free time. I loved this project. It was so much fun. I shot multiple formats. Oftentimes I would pick a different format depending on the park I was in and the kind of flavor of what I wanted to do. I had an absolute blast. I think the work was really strong. I've sold a ton of prints from this back in the day when I was selling prints and wanting to be a photographer. I would consider this a very successful project. It never ran anywhere, nothing. It was never shown. And that's really the last takeaway point that I want you to think about, is the photography is the reward. At the time that I made this work, and even going way back to the time that I started making pictures, there was no internet, there was no social media, there was no way to really build a following. There was no way to monetize a following. So the reward of making pictures like this was absolutely almost non-existent outside of the experience of making the actual photos. The experience of making the picture that we're talking about today was fantastic. It was incredible. It's about being in the field with the freedom to just pay attention to what's around you and try to make the best images possible. That's a blast. If I'm a consumer photographer, a prosumer photographer, I would forget for the most part about the professional side of the business and just enjoy the process. The photography itself is the reward. So let's take a look at this picture and I'll be back. All right, you jackals, let's have a look at this image. This image is what I would call obvious. This is a simple, basic photograph. Don't get me wrong. I like this photo. But does this define me as a photographer? No. Is it the best image from the story? No. But it has a few things going for it, which I think are very important. Because when you're telling a story with photographs, when you're doing a photo essay or a photo story, you are not shooting a portfolio. A portfolio is a bunch of random pictures that show off basically your highest quality of work as a photographer, but oftentimes your portfolio doesn't necessarily tell a story. A photo essay, a photo story does just that. So you've got to have a narrative. You're telling a story, you're showing the narrative. Narratives often have an arc, and so you need to make a variety of different kinds of pictures. This is one of those. This is what I would call an obvious basic photo that is based on the concept of layering with a wide-angle lens. In this case, 35mm on a Leica M6, and pretty basic. So I show up here at Glamis Dunes and I'm watching these guys jump from dune to dune, and if you haven't seen someone doing this, it's actually quite impressive. Kind of fun. And yes, I have pictures of the bikes in the air, isolated with nothing else, which really give you no sense of scale or accomplishment. And so what I needed to do was try to find a way to frame this up, which would give perspective. And luckily for me, there was a guy in the foreground who was waiting his turn to make the jump, whose bike provided the perfect foreground of the image right here, which if my mouse doesn't completely freak out. So here's my obvious foreground. And I think that's pretty clear to see. And here's my midground background. I guess you could say that this would be the background here too. I like these diverging lines right here of the dunes. I think that's an important piece of this pie. I think the fact that the rider is isolated in the sky, obviously peak action is what we're looking at here. And again, I'm shooting with a Leica M6, which is a one-click wind, one-click wind. So I have basically one frame of this image. I don't have two frames. I didn't have a motor drive. So the image shows a little bit of timing. It's got a sense of contained drama with the rider in the air here on his bike. I love the knobby aspect of the tires here. I think that that's kind of a nice little addition. And also, I think these people here through the spokes on the dune, the spectators, that's kind of nice. Now, these people are going to get lost in a quick, anyone taking a quick look at this image is probably going to miss those people. That's fine. This is a basic picture. Foreground, background. This is simple, and I want to bring this up because let's take the covers of the National Geographic, for example, National Geographic magazine. Historically, the covers of the National Geographic are what we would call an easy read. They're images that are very simple, very basic, very graphic, and very easy to read quickly. They're not visually complex images because that's not what covers are about. The other thing about an image like this is what I want to bring your attention to is actually the top of the frame. There is absolutely nothing here, which you might think, well, that sucks. You didn't get any clouds. You got this open space. But it's not, because this, my friends, is where the copy goes. This is, again, a very simple, basic image, but it's graphic. It captures people's attention. It's easy to read, and it also gives me plenty of space to run copy over the top of this. This could be a perfect magazine cover. It could be something simple, strong, basic like that. So there's not a whole heck of a lot to explain about this image other than the fact that I'm taking a wide-angle lens and I've used that wide angle to build depth by having my foreground and my background. That's really it. I mean, when I saw the components of this image come together, in my head, it was just a basic checklist moment where I just said, yep, graphic, simple, easy, boom, got it, move on. And then I really spent the rest of the time looking for those sort of not once in a lifetime, but once in a story moments where I've got multiple things working, foreground, midground, background, in the right kind of light, the right motion. Those are few and far between. And again, an image like this makes you feel good because it makes you think that you're making progress on the story. And in fact, this image did make the final cut of the story. So yes, it was a productive moment. But again, a lot of people have mentioned this picture to me and said, oh, I love that picture from the dunes. This is an image that would sell. You know, there's a lot of folks out there who collect imagery about California deserts, about off-highway vehicle recreation parks, the work that's done in places like El Mirage Dry Lake. I've sold prints from that location a ton. And so on one side, I look at this picture and I go, yes, this is a viable economic image for me if I was in the mood to like try to sell photographs. But as a piece of the story, yes, nice little building block, nothing else. So hopefully that was helpful. That was interesting. And I'll be back. Well. So yes, motorcycles, dunes, high octane gasoline, dust, sand, Leicas, dune buggies, taking notes, writing stories, enjoying life. That's what reportage, that's what documentary is all about. So I hope you enjoyed that episode. And if this is in focus, I will cut it and put it online for your viewing pleasure.